welcome to Balance's webinar titled Why Dieting Isn't the Answer. We'll be starting in a few moments as everyone gets logged in. Thank you for taking the time to log on today and learn more about this topic. Just by logging on, you're taking the time and putting some energy into learning about yourself and getting some support. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit it through the Q&A feature, and we'll be answering questions during the webinar, and we'll have a little Q&A section at the end. So now I'd like to introduce to you our webinar leader, Ximena. She is a registered dietitian here at Balance.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Thanks, Taylor, for the introduction. Like Taylor said, I'm one of the dietitians here at Balance. My name is Ximena. And today I wanted to talk about why dieting isn't the answer, especially during this post-COVID world that we're entering. All right, so let's get into it. So just to give you a little overview of what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to go over what diet culture is. We're going to discuss a little bit about what diet culture looks like during COVID, why diets don't work, moving away from diet culture, and what is intuitive eating. So I just want to start off by discussing what diet culture is. And this could be a whole other webinar in itself. So I'm just going to try to kind of be to the point. So diet culture is it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's growing every year. It prioritizes weight loss, appearance, and smaller bodies over true health and well-being. And it categorizes food as good or bad, healthy or unhealthy, so very black and white. And usually dieting is linked to being healthy or the sense of morality. So, oh, I'm being good because I'm following this diet. That's what I mean by morality. And then it also creates a negative relationship around movement. When I speak about movement, I'm talking about exercise. So we start seeing movement as punishment, as a way of almost as a penance for the things that we're eating. And it takes away that enjoyment from food. And it's also diet culture is based on external rules versus internal rules. And what I mean by that is society. The external rules are society, social media, magazines, influencers, versus listening to ourselves and our cues. And where can we find it? Sometimes diet culture is very sneaky. We can see it, like I said, on social media, on commercials, magazines, also from our healthcare providers. Sometimes it's not so obvious, and sometimes it's not meant as a harm, but it can really harm us, and we'll get into why it does. But it can be very sneaky, and we can also find it in our families, in schools, so it can be everywhere. So what has life looked like during the COVID-19 pandemic? I know everyone has experienced it differently, but in terms of what we're talking about today, we've seen an increase in weight discrimination, especially as BMI has been, and BMI means body mass index, as higher BMIs have been named as a risk factor for COVID, which there's some studies that show that actually higher BMIs are not a risk factor for COVID. And if you want to learn more about this, COVID and higher BMIs and just weight, Christy Harrison has done a lot of work on this. So you can go to her website. Christy Harrison is her name. During COVID-19, we've also seen increased stress for all of us, whether because it's been changes in our work, in our life, in the uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen. There's been an increase in fear of change. What's going to happen? We've also been feeling more isolated, and all of this has led to a decline in mental health. And we've seen that there's studies showing already that there's been a big decline in mental health, increase in depression and anxiety. And there's also been an increase in eating disorders and disordered eating as well. So let's get into why diets don't work. So ever wonder why there's always a new best diet? It feels like almost every year there's something new coming out, this new diet that's gonna help you achieve happiness. And the answer is that diets just don't work. And in fact, and this is not to say, what I'm gonna say next is not to say that weight gain is bad, but dieting actually increases the risk for weight gain. And I point that out because the whole point, or why many people go on diets, is to lose weight or change their bodies in some way. And it's actually doing the opposite. Again, that's not to say that weight gain is bad in any way, but it's just kind of against what diets are supposed to do. So let's talk a little bit about why diets don't work. So on the biological side, the physical side, diets slow down our metabolism. So our bodies become better at using the energy, the calories that we're providing. It becomes better at using less and less, which you would think is a good thing, but it's not, because then every time, basically our body's not functioning at 100% if we're cutting out the amount of energy our body is getting. If you think about a factory, if something's wrong in a factory, then they have to start shutting down certain areas in the factory if they don't have enough workers, for example. And our body kind of works in the same way. If it's not getting enough fuel to function at 100%, it's going to start maybe shutting things down that aren't as important. Another thing is that so these are all biological mechanisms that our body is involved in to make sure that we don't lose weight, because losing weight our body sees that as famine. And it might not seem like it to you, but when our body experiences a decrease in amount of energy that it's receiving, it's just saying, hey, something's going on, we don't have enough food, so we need to make sure that we're getting enough food. So when that's happening, when our body experiences that, the leptin, which is a satiety hormone, the levels of leptin decrease. What our body is trying to do is make sure that we're getting enough food. Ghrelin is the hunger hormone, and ghrelin levels increase. So our body is trying to make us hungrier, so we want to eat more in order to make sure that we're getting enough fuel. And then we also might experience increased cravings and binges. And that leads me to the psychological mechanism, so the mental part of it. So we might be more fixated on food because our body is trying to tell us, hey, go out and get some food. We need to make sure we're doing okay and we're running at 100%, and we need that fuel. Diets also remove the pleasure from food. If we're only thinking about, oh, I need to only eat this, and then we think about it too mechanically, then we remove that part of food that's involved in culture and celebrations and making it a pleasurable thing. We also make foods become off limits. So there's bad food. So then going back to that good and bad foods, and we may feel out of control. Like we can't, and that's part of the psychological mechanisms, because our body's doing everything it can to make sure it's getting enough fuel. So other ways to show that diets don't work So as I was mentioning earlier, our body perceives diets as famine, and diets are unsustainable. They're asking you to make a lot of changes in a short amount of time, and do this in 30 days, you'll see your life will change. What about the other, however, 335 days of the year, every other year in your life? What's going on there? Are those changes that the diet is recommending sustainable for the rest of your life? Typically, they're not. The diets are also short-term, so they're telling you to make short-term changes, and then you can forget about it. And that's what we see is usually that's not the case. It's also, these diets are also one size fits all. So we're not thinking about the fact that we're all different. We all have different needs. One size fits all. It also erodes our self-trust. We stop thinking, we might think, why is this diet not working for me? Why is Joe doing so well on this diet? Or even on the commercial, we see that, the person looks so happy and healthy. And why is that not working for me? And another way that diets don't work is that every time we go through a diet, every time our body experiences a diet, it becomes smarter. So remember, again, our body doesn't see a diet, as something that we're choosing to do. It just sees it as a famine. So it learns different ways to make sure that next time it happens, we're prepared. We also, when diets withdraw us from society, from doing social things, because if you start thinking, oh, well, I can't have dinner with these people because they won't have the food that I need to have, or I'm going to be too nervous to eat around others, whatever it might be. So we start having that withdrawal. And studies show that dieting, people that diet are at higher risk of starting to develop disordered eating. I can't remember off the top of my head, so don't take my word for this, but it's about 30% of people who are on diets, those habits turn to disordered eating. And from those people that develop disordered eating, about 35 to 45% then develop an eating disorder. So what are some of the costs of diet culture? Like we were talking earlier, it diminishes our self-esteem. We start thinking that something's wrong with us, that we are doing something, we're not meant to have a diet or be on a diet, when really it's the opposite. It also makes us feel irreparably broken. We also waste time focusing on food when perhaps we could spend that time thinking about other things or doing other things. It wastes money. If you think about all the reason why the diet culture is a multi-billion dollar industry, is because they're selling all these protocols, products, books, diet foods, pills, whatever, you name it. So we buy these things. They also make us feel shameful for our food choices because it's so black and white, good and bad, healthy, unhealthy. It distracts us from our purpose and our potential because we're constantly trying to fit into this diet, and we're not, instead of spending more time perhaps on other things that we might enjoy more. It oppresses people that don't fit into the mold, and it steals away from our time with loved ones if we're always thinking about what we should be doing instead of interacting socially and spending time with them. Going back to what I said earlier, removes the enjoyment from physical activity because we look at physical activity or movement as a penance, as a punishment for how we are eating. And for some people, we might not be able to receive appropriate medical care because of our body or what our body looks like. And So that is a big problem for many of us. And it drowns the pleasure and the joy in life. So I just want you to take a moment, maybe now, maybe later, whenever you have a moment, maybe after the presentation, and just think about how has dieting affected your social life, your eating behaviors, your mind and mood, or anything else in your life. How has dieting affected you? And if perhaps it hasn't, think about someone in your life that you think has been affected by dieting and diet culture. What physical consequences have you experienced from dieting? And how much time and money have you spent pursuing weight loss? Just, if you want to jot it down or take a mental snapshot of this so you can maybe think about it later. So we spoke a little bit about what diet culture looks like, why diets don't work. So what do we do instead? So we will get into that. So how do we move away from diet culture? And I hope this little flow chart is somewhat clear. And I will be referring back to this in a few slides. There's a few stages to moving away from diet culture. The first one is hitting diet bottom. At this point, we realize that diets don't work, that it's not going to work for us. We might feel anger, we might feel sadness. And this is a really difficult part of the process. And we're kind of at a loss and we don't know where to go from here. That leads us to the exploration phase, where we are reconnecting with our body's signals and kind of exploring what not dieting looks like. This can be a really scary phase for many people, and for some, it can revert back. People at this point can say, no, I'm going back to my diet, because it can be really uncomfortable and scary. But it's an important step for sure. From there, we go to what I call cementing. So this is where we start building trust and respect in ourselves, in our body, and what our body is telling us. We're reconnecting again. We're building that trust, and we're reconnecting with what our body is telling us, with our body's internal cues versus focusing on the external cues that we were talking about earlier. From there, we move into intuitive eating, when we start exploring what intuitive eating might look like. And at this point, we are more attuned with our body and our mind. So what our body is asking for, what our mind is asking for. And this is where pleasure and satisfaction start around food and meal times starts reemerging. And it's starts becoming less difficult at this point. From there, we go to the reclaiming phase. And this is where we lose the guilt around food. We don't feel the diet culture, the pressure from diet culture. And we start looking for alternatives to dealing with emotions, or better yet, we have alternatives to dealing with our emotions, because for many of us, food can often, or the lack of food can sometimes be the way that we deal with our emotions. The process can vary in length from person to person. For some, it can take a really long time, and it also depends. There's not a certain amount of time that you spend in each phase. For some people, the exploration phase might be really long. For others, it might be shorter, and perhaps the cementing phase is longer. So it can vary from person to person. And I just wanted to say, in the reclaiming phase, it's not to say that you are no longer aware of diet culture's pressures, and that's not the point. The point is that you will be aware of diet culture's pressures, because it's everywhere, it's all around us. But at this point, it no longer affects us. It no longer impacts the way we feel about ourselves or the way we eat. And we have other ways, other mechanisms to cope with those pressures. That's an important point to make. So let's look into this a little deeper. So perhaps some of you know what intuitive eating is, perhaps you don't. So intuitive eating is an eating approach. It was developed by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch. It's an eating approach that connects your mind and body and helps you tune into your internal cues. And the internal cues I'm referring to are hunger and satiety, to make decisions about food that feel good in your body. Intuitive eating it has no food judgment, so there's no good versus bad foods. We just see it as nourishment, as fuel for our bodies. And it helps us make decisions that are not influenced by diet culture and has no ulterior goals. What I mean by that is the ulterior goals is losing weight or changing our bodies in some way, because sometimes diet culture can be sneaky like that and say, oh, this is all about developing healthy habits or whatnot in order to lose weight. That's the underlying goal. And I want to emphasize, it is not a diet. Intuitive eating is not a diet. So intuitive eating has sort of 10 principles. They're not rules, they're just kind of goalposts to help us through the process of intuitive eating. And I wanted to mention as well that we are all born intuitive eaters. If you think about, if you yourself have a child or a baby, or someone in your life has had a baby, you might be aware of how well babies know themselves, or toddlers. When they're hungry, they will make it known that they're hungry. When they're satisfied, when they're full, they will also make it known. They'll maybe they turn their head or whatever they might do, push the bottle or the food away, so they know, they're very in tune with themselves. As we grow up and we start socializing more with others and we go into society, that's when we start getting all these other influences that might kind of throw our intuitive eater off. But the good news is we can all become intuitive eaters again. And that's why these principles were developed, in order to help guide us through that process. So these are the 10 principles: reject the diet mentality, honor your hunger, make peace with food, challenge the food police, feel your fullness, discover the satisfaction factor, cope with your emotions with kindness, respect your body, movement, feel the difference, honor your health with gentle nutrition. And I'm not going to go into detail about every one of these principles. This is also a whole other talk. I encourage you, if you're not aware of intuitive eating, I encourage you to perhaps read the book. There is a book out, it's called Intuitive Eating. And it goes through all the principles. But going back to that little flow chart that I was showing you guys earlier, we're going to see how these principles and the flow chart kind of link together. And if you have any questions about any of these principles in specific, you can let me know at the end of the presentation. We can kind of delve into it a little more. So like I said, going back to the flow chart, that first step, it was hitting diet bottom. So how do we apply the principles of intuitive eating to the different stages of moving away from diet culture? So at this point, we're realizing the diets don't work. We're at a loss for what to do and how to change. Like I said, we might be angry at how diet culture has affected our life. And we recognize how it's hurt us physically and emotionally. And we also realize that we're holding on to the diet mentality. And if you remember, one of the principles of intuitive eating was reject the diet mentality. So this is where we become aware of all those diet culture thoughts and diet mentality that we're holding on to. And we just want to become aware of it and start rejecting it. How do we do that? because this can be a long process for some of us. One of the steps that we can take when we're at this point is getting rid of the dieter's tools. So that might be, for some of us, that might be getting rid of the scale or the diet books that we have. For others, especially nowadays, it might be kind of clearing up our social media feed. You might not realize, but social media can have a huge impact on us and our thoughts. Even if we're just scrolling through and we see something and we don't pay attention to it, that thought might still stick in your head, and you might subconsciously or consciously be thinking about it. So cleaning up your social media, maybe looking for more non-diet focused accounts might be helpful, a helpful step. And also be very compassionate towards yourself, realizing that this is not your fault. This is just a society, it's a big industry that has affected us all. And it's no wonder that we are feeling this way, that we are constantly seeking diets, because the industry has created it so that we are doing that. So it's definitely not your fault, and give yourself some compassion. So the next phase in that flow chart was exploration. So here is where we're becoming reacquainted with your body. I find working with clients that very often we are not in tune with what our body is telling us. We are not aware of when our body's actually hungry or full. But the first step is really knowing when our body is hungry, sorry. If we're following diets, or if we're following what we've heard from a friend or what our coworker is doing, they might be following a diet. So we want to do what they're doing. So we might be listening to those external cues. And this is when we start listening to the internal cues. What is our body telling us? And our body might tell us in different ways. And that's how we need to just take some time and figure out, how is our body communicating to us? During this phase, we might be hyper conscious, because we're always like kind of listening to say, oh, what is my body telling me right now? It might be uncomfortable. And you might feel like you're being a little obsessive, but it's just a phase. It's not an obsession with food, it's just a hyper consciousness. So you're being very conscious of what's going on with your body and how things might be impacting you, or what thoughts are going through your mind. Another part of exploration is giving yourself unconditional permission to eat. This can be very difficult. What I mean by that is doing away with the thoughts of good and bad food, healthy, unhealthy. This is where we start thinking of food as just fuel for our bodies, and allowing ourselves to have whatever food our body is asking for. This can be a very difficult step. Like we were talking about earlier, recognizing your hunger cues and realizing whether those cues are biological or emotional. Either cue is fine. The important thing is to realize which one it is. Am I feeling something and that's why I'm feeling hungry, or is it actually, biologically, am I feeling hunger? Understanding how much food your body actually needs. I find that most people are not aware of how much food their body actually needs to work 100%. And that can change from person to person. There's no one size fits all. That's also why diets don't work, like we were talking about earlier. Everyone needs different amounts. So during this exploration phase, that's what you're exploring and coming to the realization. That can be very difficult. You may start experiencing feelings that are uncomfortable, and that perhaps you were dealing with those emotions with food or without food in order to kind of avoid the feelings. But now that you're being more aware of your body, you're being more hyper conscious, you might start feeling some uncomfortable feelings again. And remember that during this phase, we are mending perhaps years of restriction. It's not the case for everyone, but for many of us, it's years of restriction, negative self-talk, and guilt around food. And that can take time. So again, we need some of that self-compassion. The next phase is cementing. So at this point, we start feeling more grounded in the exploration work that we've been doing, that really hard work. And we're more in sync with our body's cues, the hunger, the satiety. Food thoughts might seem less obsessive. We might feel like we're not constantly thinking about food, which can happen for many people when we start this journey. And we start trusting our body. During the exploration phase, we might feel like, you know, I'm going to be out of control. How can I do this? And after doing all that exploration work, we might realize, oh no, my body knows what it needs. And we start trusting it. We're better able to honor our hunger. We start understanding feelings of fullness and satiety. So that's why figuring out hunger first is more important than comes first before feeling your fullness. That's when you start exploring that phase. And we start exploring ways to cope with those strong emotions that perhaps we've started feeling more of. We start to respect our body and realize, you know, what our body is capable of doing for us. And we feel more empowered because there's a way we're doing things for our body and we see how our body is reacting to it. And we feel like we can trust our body more. So the intuitive phase, the intuitive eating phase. So at this point, our relationship with food is more peaceful and it's easier. We don't have to put so much thought in, as much thought into it. We are able to choose foods we really want and enjoy because they're going to satisfy us and not because Joe was telling us that we should have it because it's going to do amazing things for us. We're able to choose when to stop eating because we're satisfied or because, you know, maybe we want to eat a little more because it tastes so good and then we feel satisfied. Whatever that might be for you in any given time. We're better able to assess foods that make us feel better. So I like during the exploration phase, we might feel like we're in the honeymoon phase, which is that's when we're exploring all these new foods and it's all very exciting. And, you know, we were like, oh, is this ever going to end? And the truth is that during this process of the moving away from diet culture, we're not always going to be eating the same way because we're exploring, we're figuring out all these things that we haven't allowed ourselves to eat. We're giving ourselves permission. And maybe after it gets a little boring, we start making our food choices a little more balanced, a little more varied. It's a process though. We can't just jump to that point, which I know many people want to. Food loses its alluring power, going back to that honeymoon phase. That's when everything is really exciting. But after we've given ourselves time to be in that honeymoon phase, food kind of loses its power and we see it as fuel. There's no more guilt around foods that were previously restricted or bad, and we just see it as nourishment. We are less afraid of sitting with our feelings during the intuitive eating phase because we have other ways of coping with it. That's not to say that food can't be a coping mechanism, but it's not the only way. And we respect our body more. It's not to say, you know, when people see respect, they think love your body. And I'm not saying that you have to love your body, but just acknowledge what your body is able to do and respect it for it and take care of it so that it can continue doing those things for you. And the final phase was reclaiming. So this is when we're fully reconnected with our intuitive eater, like we were when we were a baby or a toddler. We're very in tune with what is going on with our body, inside our body. We're no longer using food or lack of it as our primary coping skill. We have other coping skills. We find pleasure in food, movement, or physical activity is no longer punishment. We can enjoy our relationship with food and movement is very different at this phase. It's more about the pleasure in doing things versus finding ways to punish ourselves, whether we realize it's a punishment or not. It's a form of self-care, as I say in the next point. And concern over weight diminishes. It's not to say that you will never care about weight, because like I said, we do live in a diet culture. And while we live in that diet culture, weight is going to come up and it's going to be talked about amongst our friends, coworkers, family, whatever. Weight will come up and it might make us doubt a little bit, but we have other forms of coping with those doubts and with those fears at this phase when we have reclaimed our intuitive eater. So what are some of the benefits of intuitive eating? We see lower rates of emotional eating and eating disorders when we are back in tune with our intuitive eater. And these are all based on studies. I've also see it with my clients. I'm not just making them up. We see better body image, higher self-esteem, higher life satisfaction, higher HDL cholesterol, that's the good cholesterol, lower triglycerides, and improved proactive coping skills. So we see both biological benefits and psychological benefits. And I want to invite you, I think you guys already got this link in a reminder email, but Taylor's also going to send it in the chat. I invite you to complete the intuitive eating assessment scale. And this is a scale just made to see where you are in that intuitive eating journey. Wherever you are, that's okay. It's a journey, like I said, and it's just for us to be aware. Sometimes I like to do it with my clients to see, when we start, they fill it in, and when they're further along in their journey, we do it again to see what's changed. What areas do we still need to work on? What areas are we having more trouble in? So it can just help us be more aware of where we are and how diet culture is impacting our lives. So if you have a moment today, I encourage you to fill it out, take a look at it, see what's coming up for you. And I will open it up to questions and just let you know that we'll answer the questions now, but if you are interested in doing some coaching or counseling, I am available, and you can book a call. You can go on this website so you can learn more about nutrition coaching and counseling, but I'll open it up to questions now.
All right, so we've got some questions in the chat. So when working with clients, do you navigate through the principles in the same exact order?
That's a great question. So every person is going to be different. For some clients, it is, we go 1 through 10. The principles were created in that order for a reason, but that's not always how I go about it and not how it's supposed to be done. Sometimes perhaps people are already working on something else. So, and also sometimes I go back and revisit one of the principles. Perhaps something is coming up around, diet culture, like a client maybe had an experience where something really came up for them that was a very, very strong emotion. So maybe we revisit that rejecting the diet mentality to reconnect with why the client is doing it, what's coming up for them. So we might go back and forth. I do recommend that the last principles where we're talking about gentle nutrition, movement, respect your body, those principles are at the end for a reason, because we can't really get to those principles unless we've done the initial work. So there is somewhat of a structure, but you don't have to stick to it to the T.
All righty, and then another question was, in regards to unconditional permission to eat. Does that mean eating whatever, whenever, and however?
Yeah, that's often a question that comes up with clients a lot when they hear unconditional permission to eat. It's a little scary. And the answer is that yes, you are allowed to eat whatever you want, whatever your body is telling you, but it's listening to what your body is saying. It's not just, that's why we're following the principles, and we're honoring your hunger is one of the principles. So we're trying not just eat whenever because the food is there, although sometimes that is part of intuitive eating. If you're in a social gathering, you might not be very hungry, but perhaps there's food and that's what people are doing, so you're being flexible. But most of the time you're listening to what your body is telling you and honoring your body. So we try to listen to, in the beginning especially, we try to create perhaps a little more, even if you don't know what hunger looks like for you, you don't know when you're hungry, perhaps creating a bit of structure throughout your day. When we create that structure, when eating is becoming more regular, that's when clients sometimes start reconnecting with their hunger cues, and they can start honoring their hunger. So it's not just eat whenever, all the time, all day. It's listening to your body, because most of, if you do decide to eat whatever, whenever, all day long, you might realize that you don't feel so great. So it's really trying to listen to your body and what your body is telling you.
Okay, so another question that we have is, do you have any specific approaches or responses to those who bring up losing the quarantine 15 or negatively talk about weight gained during the pandemic?
Yeah, this is such a, from the beginning, it's been such a big problem. We've been seeing it all over social media, the quarantine 15 or whatever other term has been created. And I have so much compassion. I think one of the biggest things we have to have with our clients is a lot of compassion, and realizing that we do live in this diet culture, diet-centric society. And it's really difficult. And we see, get your pre-COVID body back. So I encourage you, if that's what your clients are bringing up, I encourage you to discuss what is coming up for them behind that. What are they trying to seek by trying to lose that weight? Perhaps it's, social anxiety of starting to see people again. So is it really about the weight? And it can be about the weight. But what other things can we work on instead of weight loss? And working through, intuitive eating, through the steps, through where, perhaps the rejecting the diet mentality can be where they're stuck. So exploring those areas and perhaps giving them some space to express what they're feeling.
Okay. And then another question that we have is, do you still hold off on the gentle nutrition when working with someone with hypertension, for example?
So I will say we want to keep if they have certain medical conditions, this intuitive eating works for everyone. I just want to start off by saying that it works for everyone. For people that have hypertension or other medical conditions, we want to keep that in mind. We're not just ignoring that completely. But often we see that when we start following through the intuitive eating process, their hypertension, their blood pressure might actually improve because they're better able to listen to their body. I do not ignore completely their medical conditions, because it is important, and they also are, your client wants to be heard and listened to. But the overall gentle nutrition we're going to explore towards the end, but we do want to keep some of those medical conditions in mind while we start delving into the intuitive eating process.
Do you have any advice for finding providers that connect with culture and connect with client-specific culture? Because sometimes that can be a barrier in recovery when you're not able to connect that way with the dietitians that you're working with.
Absolutely, yes. That is a big part of the recovery process, is being able to connect and feeling listened and heard. And part of that is connecting with people that share your culture, share your cultural experiences. There is a list, and I cannot remember who created this list. So we might have to get back to you on this, but I know there's Christy Harrison might have a list of providers. I know she has a list of providers. I don't think they're divided culturally. I wish I could give you an actual source right now. There are sources out there that kind of go through people of different cultures. So I can't give you a straight answer right now, but we're going to try to get back to you on that, because it is a very important point.
Okay, and then how do you get yourself in a positive mindset or better habits when you've struggled with eating disorders, yo-yo dieting, obesity, and low self-esteem your whole life?
Yeah, it's so difficult. Like I said, diet culture is all around us, and I have so much compassion for everyone, really, because we are in this together. And thanks for asking that question. I think the first step, if we go back to the stages that we were going through, that first step of hitting diet bottom is where we have to start. And that can be really uncomfortable, because we have to sit with that uncomfortable feeling. We have to really feel perhaps that sadness, that anger, but all those feelings are really good feelings. They're not bad feelings. They can be very productive, and we want to use those feelings that you've been feeling on the recovery path, on the recovery road. I encourage you, if you've been struggling with this for a very long time, to seek out support it can be from anyone, from someone in your life that you respect, a loved one, a therapist, a dietitian, anyone in your life that you might feel comfortable with reaching out. That can be the first step, because this recovery process can be very difficult and very lonely if you're doing it on your own. And it can be easy when it gets hard to give up, but you can achieve recovery. You can achieve those goals that you've been working for. So I highly encourage you to seek that support from loved ones or from someone that you trust in your life.
Okay, so when people are not in the same body type are trying to talk about, these food struggles, how do you go about understanding and getting others to understand, even when they say you look a certain way, so you can't understand?
Yeah, that happens all the time, because I can't give you a straight answer at the moment, because it's a complicated issue and one that I discuss with clients frequently. So if you do have a therapist or a dietitian, I encourage you to explore that with them. Sometimes what in that situation, if you don't want to get into that situation sometimes, or that discussion, if it's not comfortable for you the moment, sometimes just gently moving the conversation to something slightly related but away from weight can be helpful. It can be really difficult to not, and understand also that that person might be going through their own things, and they might not feel understood. They might be lonely. So it's not necessarily about you, even though you might be feeling those similar things and you're trying to identify with a person, but understanding that everyone's going through their own process and might be expressing themselves differently. So having compassion for yourself, having compassion for that other person, and maybe moving the conversation gently away to something else. Maybe in the future, you can revisit that. I encourage you to, like I said, to speak to someone else in your life who might be able to have a more objective view, maybe a therapist, a dietitian, to see how, if it is something that you want to connect on with that person, see how you might be able to navigate that conversation. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, so I seem to be stuck in the honeymoon phase. What are some tips to get out of it slowly but surely?
Yeah, so the honeymoon phase varies, the length of time varies from person to person. So I encourage, even though for some people it can be scary to be in that honeymoon phase and you're thinking, when is this going to end? When am I going to move forward? I encourage you not to hurry the process. If you are still feeling like you're in that honeymoon phase, experience it. It might be uncomfortable. Those feelings are important to feel. You're not alone in what you're feeling, but allowing yourself to be in that and explore what's going on, what's coming up for me. Perhaps consider, and think about, are you in the honeymoon phase because you're nervous about exploring other things that perhaps were, in the black and white thinking before, like this is good, this is bad, and you're not allowing yourself to have the quote unquote good foods anymore, or whatever it might be. What's going on for you there? What emotions are coming up for you? Because it's not only about the food, it's also about how we're feeling and the emotions that we're feeling around that food. So maybe spend some time just when you're having the food that you're enjoying at the moment, take a moment, listen to what your body's telling you. What are you feeling around that food? What is your mind? What is your body telling you? And really just spend some time in that phase and explore that.
All right, so we have time for one last question. Do you ever recommend any sort of cleanse or eating modifications to help with the process of shifting your body's relationship with foods that have become addictive?
Yeah, so I do not recommend any cleanses or any kind of detoxes or any diets like that. I know there's often definitely some people that say like, oh, it's a reset, basically to start over again. I think when we start with going into those resets, those cleanses, we're still propagating the diet culture mentality. So it's almost like you are, because during those cleanses, you are probably restricting other foods. And so it's just that restriction mentality is just getting reinforced. So we don't want to continue reinforcing that. We want to allow unconditional permission to eat. So I don't recommend any cleanses before that. What I do recommend is starting to eat more regularly throughout the day and more consistent, so that your body doesn't feel like it's going into that famine mode.
All right. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Ximena, for taking the time to present to us today. You guys will all see a survey appear after the webinar ends, and we'd love to hear how we can be of any assistance or support for you guys during this time. And I'm also going to include the link that Ximena has up on the slide right now, so that way if you have any other questions or would like to talk about some services with us here at Balance, you may do so by booking a call with us. It's a free 20-minute complimentary call. And like I said, we can talk about any services that we have or just answer any questions that you might have about starting recovery. So I'm going to include that right now.
Well, thank you everyone for coming and for your great questions. And yes, please continue to let us know how we can best support you.